Welcome to my two-part video series on how I painted Doctor Strange for Marvel Crisis Protocol. In the second video, I'm going to be painting the actual Doctor Strange model itself. To prime our miniature, we're using Vallejo Surface Primer Black. To paint the cape, we're using AK Tenebris Gray, Burnt Red, Blood Red, and Vallejo Fireframe for the red, and then scale colors Indian Shadow, Sahara Yellow, and Tener Yellow for the gold trim. To paint the blue suit, we're using AK Black, Dark Sea Blue, Light Prussian Blue, Aquatic Turquoise, Pale Blue, Greenish White, and White. To paint the green flame and hand, we're using AK Dark Sea Blue, scale colors Black Forest Green, Barati Green, Spring Green, and Vallejo Livery Green. To paint the skin and hair, we're using AK's Base Flesh, Beige Red, Pale Scan, AK's Rubber Black, scale colors Hellbound Flesh, and AK White. To paint the gold clasp on his neck, we're using Vallejo Burnt Umber, English Uniform, Japanese Uniform World War II, and Ice Yellow. Glazes are applied to the model with Vallejo's Scarlet Red and Hex Lichen. So to work on the cape, we're using three colors from AK. We're using AK's Tenebris Gray and Burnt Red in a 50-50 mix. This is our base coat, which you can see I've already applied to the model. You're going to want to do this in probably two or three coats, not heavily diluted, but diluted enough to give you a nice, smooth, even coverage. Do a few passes if you have to. Don't try and chunk it on all in one go. The smoother it is, the nicer it's going to look, especially once we start getting our highlights in there, especially on a big surface area like this. We're also going to be using AK Blood Red, and essentially from this base coat, we're highlighting progressively into pure Burnt Red, and then mixing in more and more Blood Red until we're pure Blood Red. So on top of the base coat, which is about, again, 50-50, we're going to go a little more with our Burnt Red. Not pure Burnt Red yet, but we'll go a little brighter. Probably, I would say 60-40, 75-25. And we're just going to build up progressive layers, keeping in mind, of course, the folds in the cape and the direction of our light source and how that's going to impact how light plays around and across. It's not super sharp on the edges and corners where you're going to need to have sudden jumps in brights and darks, but you can exaggerate it if you want, especially in some of these deeper folds leading up into the back. And if we overpaint onto the edge trim, which is going to be yellow, not a big deal. We're going to be using the same similar yellow recipe that we did on the base as a bit of a tie-in. So you'll know that the colors we're using, the Indian Shadow, Sahara Yellow mixture, tends to base coat pretty nicely on dark and midtones. Now I'm going to introduce some of this brighter mixture into the shadow portion right here. Even though or that is part of the shadow of the fold, I don't want it to be too dark. And then because we're going to be taking the brighter areas to pure Blood Red, which is very bright, I want to have some nice subtle shifts in the shadows as well as the highlights. Now I'm just working in two small little areas of the cape, just on this corner. But you're probably going to want to do highlight passes over the entire cape. This will also allow you to work everything overall, finish up sort of one level of highlights, and then come back to an area that's already had paint applied. And then it'll be dry and you can move on to your next step. As always, when we're laying down our colors, we're going to keep our brush strokes nice and short, and we're going to apply them in different directions to help smooth out and eliminate any sort of brush strokes that we're going to see on the finished cape. And once we've got the pure burnt red down, we can start mixing in blood red into our mixture. And then we're just progressively laying down more and more brighter colors until we've reached pure blood red in our brightest spots. Now, the jump between burnt red and blood red is quite large. You're going to have to do a lot of transition steps, a lot of incremental highlight passes to slowly build up this color. If you go too sudden too quickly, you're going to end up with jumps that may be too sudden. You're going to have a lot of resulting streaks in your brush strokes as you're trying to smooth out your blends. So I highly recommend just taking your time and building up your layers of color. Really play around with sort of how you're applying your highlights to make the cape a little more interesting, because on the surface, the way it's sculpted, it is fairly simple. It's just up like a zigzag, up, down, up, down, up, down, like a sine wave. So I think there's a lot of room to add little micro folds and undulations in the cape to create a much more interesting color variation across the surface. So once we have the red cape finished, what we want to do is move on to the black suit. Now, there is trimming on the cape. We are going to be painting this yellow to match the energy on the base, maybe not quite as saturated. I don't quite know yet. I'll have to sort of visually play around, and it's not really a thick, prominent part of the cape. So if it's the same yellow, it might not be an issue. I might want to paint it more like non-metal gold, but more or less it's going to be yellow or some sort of yellow ochre. But because of the way it borders the suit, I actually want to paint the dark blue of the suit first. And that way, if I'm a little messy, if I overpaint anything onto this trim, especially around this back arm and chest area, you can see right here, the angle's a little tricky to get to. I don't want to have to worry or fuss about repainting any of the yellow. So I want to paint the black first, for black suit, and then get to the trim of the cape. So the artwork for the Sorcerer Supreme outfit has him in black. However, I feel like on this model, I want a lot more color on him. I don't want just plain black. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be painting the suit with hints of blue. So it's going to be a blue-black. And that's sort of a callback to the original Strange blue outfit, or the blue suit. I'm still going to try and keep it mostly black, but rather than be a more neutral or sort of a brown or the green-black I've been using for all my convocation, I just wanted to bring in some hints of blue. So the colors we're going to be using for this AK black is the base coat, and then we're going to highlight by mixing in AK's dark sea blue, some light Prussian blue, and then scale colors Tenaire yellow. And this is mainly used to brighten up the color, brighten up this blue. The blue's going to saturate a little bit, intermediary color. And we're going to try not to go too overboard in the yellow. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a 50-50 mix of black and dark sea blue. And we're just going to start blocking in some of the major forms, the major areas that are going to be receiving highlights. I'm not overly concerned about maintaining any of the little details or highlighting any of the details. That'll come later when I begin to refine it and I use the airbrush to smooth out the blends. It's also why I'm not too worried about the transition steps from black all the way through to blue. What I'm really focusing on at this point, first with this pass, is blocking in major areas of bright and dark. And then as I highlight up, that's when I'm going to start progressively concerning myself with individual muscle groups, muscle forms. He has a lot of markings on his suit that are going to be either a medium tone sort of gray-white or up to pure white on the chest. So we're going to play and have some fun with some of those items on the suit. It's also why we don't need to concern ourselves, because a lot of these markings, a lot of these little details on the suit aren't actually going to be black or the blue black. So no worries. And then we'll just do another pass with pure dark sea blue. Now, there's a lot more to do on the arms. It's going to be tricky for me to paint it on the camera, so I'm probably going to work on the upper body off camera, but I'll focus on the legs just to show you how I'm approaching this before I get to the airbrush. So when I get to the leg, what I'm doing is I'm actually painting. So right here is going to be a slightly stronger highlight, just because that's the, I forget the terminology, but that's the line between the brightest area and the darkest shadow. So you're actually going to have a slightly brighter line right here, and the darkest shadow is right here, before we get into some reflected light underneath. So we're not going to have pure black in the deepest shadows underneath, because that's where we're getting light reflections from. And then we're going to mix in a bit of that light Prussian blue. And this will saturate up the color a little bit. And we're taking care at this point not to overwork. We're mainly focusing on, depending on how shiny you want the suit, some specular highlights. And then we're going to mix in a little bit of that Tener yellow. And this is going to do two things. It's going to brighten up the color, so we get another highlight out of it. But because of its pastel tone, it's also going to then further desaturate it. So I know it's weird. We go from dark sea blue, which is a fairly desaturated color. We saturate it with a light Prussian blue, and then we desaturate it again with the pastel yellow. It's mainly so I can get some of that richness in the mid-tone. But I've also found that dark sea blue mixed with Tener yellow is too flat. It ends up being a very murky, almost like an earthy blue-green color. And it's not quite what I was looking for. I wanted the light Prussian blue to have a little bit more warmth to it. So even when we desaturate it with the Tener yellow, it still maintains a little bit of blue color. So if I can show you the palette right now. So this is the color progression I'm working with, and you can see that I was experimenting with just different ratios, different colors of these four to try and get something I liked. This right here is dark sea blue and Tener yellow. And you can see that it's not really a super saturated blue. There's hints of green in there, but it's very earthy. There's like a little hint of not a brown, but it's earthy. It feels earthy, whereas having the light Prussian blue in there keeps it almost in like an aqua color, something that I was looking for in the blue suit of Strange. So that's why we're mixing in the light Prussian blue. We're going from a desaturated to a bit of a saturation blue, and then desaturating again with Tener yellow. Now that we're in this fairly bright blue color, we want to start focusing on muscle groups. And we want to highlight them in a way that connects the blends. Because the muscles aren't individual things, they aren't individual little clumps on the body, they are connected both by the skin and then by the suit. Our highlights will tend to bleed and merge through in all throughout. I don't know how you call it, but where the muscles overlap and join, you're going to have highlights that connect them. It's not really super prominent in this suit, but you see it more in models where they might have like an exposed abdomen with all the abs and the pectoral muscles and everything. And you need to connect those to make it look like it's a human form with a skin on top, as opposed to individual clumps of muscle, which would be more akin to like plated armor or something. So that's about as bright as I want to take the blue. I'm going to do a working pass over the entire suit, and then we'll come back with the airbrush to knock back our highlights and tie everything together. So we've done all of the blocking in of the major highlight points. You can see that the suit is looking fairly blue right now. I'm hoping to be able to knock it back to black, especially in the shadows. But I don't want it to be too black. I'm actually pretty happy with how it's turning out right now. It's a little bit Superman, but that's pretty cool. It's a good color combo. What I'm going to do now is using the airbrush, start glazing into the midtones and shadows to smooth out the blends that I have, and then deepen some of the shadows before I go back in and start adding some specular highlights just to get that pseudo shininess that I want on the suit. So we're going to use our AK Dark Sea Blue, and then we're going to jump into black. And I'm going to introduce some tenebrous gray as well, and maybe a hint of burnt red on the backside, especially to get some of that reflection from the cape going on. The goal right now is just to keep adding color, adding nuance to really give the black suit some depth, especially from the local colors around the suit. So it's not looking so plain and flat. So I have my Dark Sea Blue right now. This is about 5 or 6 parts water, 1 part paint. And we're just going to focus on smoothing out the blends with this. All we're doing is we're doing lots of thin coats, using the airbrush to spray air to dry each coat. And then we're trying to spray from underneath to catch all of the shadows and preserve our highlights. And now we've got black loaded into the airbrush again, same kind of dilution, 5, 6 parts water, 1 part paint. We're going to now look to punch up the deepest shadows with this. And then with the black airbrushed in, we're going to do some tenebrous gray. And I'm focusing this mainly on where I would get some reflected light from the cape. So mainly on the back side, not so much on the front, although I might just catch some of the rib cage. So with the airbrushing done, we're going to go back in by hand, and we're going to take some of our blue highlight mixes, and we're just going to lightly glaze back in some of the highlights that were lost from overspray. So areas like here where I might want to bring back some of that bright blue. I'll lightly glaze in some highlights, pick out some specular points that I want to be a little sharp, a little bright. And then similarly, in areas where I don't think the shadow is deep enough or where I want to use pure black to really punch up some of those shadows, I might just go in and lightly do a glaze. For example, right here. So we'll go ahead and polish the rest of the suit before moving on to doing the yellow trim and the white portions. So with the black suit done, we can then move on to painting the yellow trim of the cape. So I'm going to approach this painting the same way as I did on the yellow of the base. So we're going to start with our scale color Indian Shadow and Sahara Yellow mix 50-50. We're going to base coat and then highlight all the way up through Sahara Yellow and Tenere Yellow before doing some glazes of yellow ink. and then we'll do a final highlighting pass with AK yellow and white. And as you start to highlight up into the Sahara yellow and Tenier yellow, the yellow ochres, make sure that you are following the highlights of the capes. You need to keep the lighting consistent in the trim to match what you've done in the red of the rest of the cape. That consistency is what's going to sell the fact that the material is the same, that this is a sort of a gold trim or embroidery and not a separate part that's behaving differently. And you can see that the trim is painted up in the yellow ochre color, and I've decided to stop it here actually. So I'd originally intended to paint the yellow much more saturated, like the spikes on the base. But as I was painting the trim, and it started turning out more like a pseudo non-metal gold as opposed to yellow, sort of the distinct separation in terms of the saturation of the two, just as a way of adding sort of an extra layer of separation between the two colors. So they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. And then just the finish that I ended up with before even getting to the yellow ink step, I actually really liked how this turned out. And I decided to just keep it and push the non-metal just a little bit more. So I went up to pure Tenier yellow, and I did a lot of edging all along the trim, top and bottom. So you can see I can really get that reflective shine going on. I'm really happy with how this came out. And really all this is it's the three scale colors that we're doing for the yellow. So it's the Indian Shadow, Sahara yellow, and Tenier yellow, just those three progressively blending up. Nothing else, very, very simple. And then when I get to painting the Eye of Agamoto on his chest, I'll probably use a different gold recipe just to add a little bit of extra depth. It's a tiny piece, so you're not going to see a huge difference between the two, but it will be there. I'll paint it with a much colder gold recipe. This is a little warmer. And it's the way of adding a little variety to the model without actually using a lot of different colors. So to paint the white markings on the suit, we're going to be using a color recipe that we've already used on the model. So the colors that we used on the suction of the tentacles, we're going to be mirroring on the white suit. And it's just a way to build sort of a symmetry between the base and the suit. I don't think it's going to be a real issue in terms of clashing. It's just a sort of cool blue-white, hint of green in there because of the greenish-white color we're using. So again, this is with AK Dark Sea Blue. And then I'm going to use AK's Pale Blue as a sort of intermediary and to just steer the color a little bit more neutral-ish and not as greenish-white as this may suggest. And then we'll once again highlight all the way through these colors into white. So that's AK Deep Sea Blue or Dark Sea Blue, Pale Blue, greenish white, and white. Our base coat is essentially a 50-50 mix of these two. And I've already started a bit of it on the suit here just to sort of block in where I'm painting the pattern. I'll mainly focus on showing you right here on this stripe because this will go up to pure white or off-white. And some of the markings, you don't necessarily have to go all the way up in terms of your highlights. So some of these V's here and some of the line markings based on the reference actually aren't quite as prominent as some of the interior more prominent, like dagger running in the center or these panels across his chest. So really play around with, based on the reference and sort of what markings you want brighter and what you want darker. So with our base coat done, we're going to go right up into our pale blue. And then from there, we can mix in a bit more of the greenish white and just continually highlight, taking the highlights brighter and brighter. It's not overly complicated. All we're doing is we're layering color and building up the markings accordingly. Now, as I highlight up, I'm going to start edge highlighting the edges, create that bit of sharpness, and then that pure greenish white. And that's basically it. Very simple for the white markings. I'm going to hold off on using any of the white right now. I'm going to get all of the markings painted first and then go back in and focus some white mainly on the chest. And with the entire suit, all the white elements brought up to that greenish white, now we can start bringing in some pure white highlights. Now, the reason I didn't jump immediately to white as I was painting each one, because white is the brightest value, you want to make sure that you've at least brought everything up to, I don't want to say a uniform highlight, but you don't lock in the white until the very, very end, because once you've applied white, there is no brighter, and the only thing you can do is take it away. So I always recommend getting everything up to about 80 or 90% before going in with the white as a last step to fine tune and really refine. So we're going to be focusing this mainly on the upper chest and maybe on parts of the fingertips. I'm just going to take pure white and gently bring it into some of the brightest highlights. And we're going to use this pretty sparingly. I'm already seeing that the white is fairly strong, very dominant already, even without having used white on the miniature. And I think any brighter, and it's going to pull away too much from the suit. And I already feel like maybe the suit needs another highlight pass, but I wanted to maybe do that after I've done the smoke and the face. So for now, we'll just do a couple of very, very thin glazes of the white. But to paint the flame on his right hand, I'm going to be using green. And this does deviate from the studio paint job. And this is largely because I wanted to incorporate some colors I'm using across all of my convocation in Doctor Strange. This green color will tie him into Baron Mordo and to Wong. I'm going to be using that sort of rich, saturated green that I used for their outfits. And it's the same recipe. The bright highlights are going to be focused around the palm. Fire at its hottest or most intense points of heat are its brightest. So we're going to have our brightest points of fire in the palm extending out into the smoke. And the colors that we're going to be using, we're going to be using AK Dark Sea Blue and Black Forest Green, 50-50 as my base coat, which I've already applied to the model. And then we're highlighting by just working our way through progressive highlights of the Black Forest Green, Erotic Green, and Spring Green. So the base coat applied, I'm just going to go right to Black Forest Green and begin highlighting. And I want to be careful as I'm applying my highlights to avoid overpainting too much onto the white. It'd be quite a lot of work to have to try and correct that. So we're just going to take our time and work our highlights across each of these little smoky tentacles. And then with the Black Forest Green, we're just going to keep highlighting through Erotic Green and Spring Green. And from pure Erotic Green, we want to start working up into our Spring Greens. We're just going to keep mixing in progressive amounts of our brighter color and highlighting up the sharp raised edges, focusing closer and closer onto the hand and fingers. So one final touch that I'm adding to the green flame, I wasn't quite happy with how bright it was, so I'm taking some livery green from Vallejo Green color. This is a very fluorescent neon green color, very lovely to work with, although I don't use it quite often because of its intensity. I'm going to refine some of the highlights on the flame, which I've already done here. You can see it's sort of a yellow-green when I've applied it in a very thin glaze. I'm not going overboard because I don't want it to be too intense, I guess. I want to be able to build up the color slowly, and so I'm working with very thin glazes to slowly work up the intensity. My mantra is it's always easier to add more. It's very hard to take away. And rather than give myself more work and more difficulty in trying to correct something if I go too heavy, I think building up the color is a smarter thing to do. What I'm also doing, or what these thin glazes are allowing me to do, is to also glaze in the glove and areas around the flame. And in this way, we can sort of get a little nice OSL thing sort of happening. We're just very gently tinting the green around it. So to paint the Eye of Agamoto on his chest, we're going to be doing a non-minimal gold, similar to the trim, but it's going to be a little bit more on the cold side. So the four colors we're going to be using for this: Vallejo's Burnt Umber, Japanese Uniform World War II, Ice Yellow, and Ivory. The Burnt Umber has a hint of red, but it's also got like hints and notes of green in there as well. And then similarly, the Japanese Uniform is more of a green ochre. So by using these colors, it's going to have similar ochre qualities to the trim of the cloak, but instead of being warm, because we used Indian Shadow and Sahara Yellow, which are warm, reddy ochres, we're using cooler green ochres to do the eye. So I've already done a base coat of Burnt Umber, and on this, we're going to start mixing in about a 50-50 of Japanese Uniform. And all we're doing is we're just highlighting up through each of the colors. The eye is quite small, not a lot of big flat surfaces, so there's no real major areas we need to blend. We're mainly focusing on picking out the individual shapes and highlighting up to get the contrast that we need to sell that this is a gold medallion. So all I'm doing is I'm just using my highlights to start picking up the basic shapes, working my way up to Japanese Uniform. I'm not focusing on smooth blends. I'm just trying to define what the actual detail on the medallion is. It looks like a crossbar with a beam running underneath and then a ring around. And then a little crest clasp thing on top. So we're going to take our pure Japanese Uniform and we're going to keep highlighting this. And I'm doing my best not to get any of the paint into the crevices. I am having to hold my breath while I apply each brush stroke, so I'm not really talking in between as I lay down each color. And from there, we can start mixing in our ivory into the Japanese uniform. I'm not going to worry about doing too many steps. I'm just looking to build up a couple of highlight steps. That's my highlight of ice yellow. Now, before I go in with some ivory, what I might want to do is take some of my base tones or mid-tones, so the burnt umber mixed with a bit of the Japanese uniform. We're going to dilute it into a bit of a glaze, and we're just going to gently push this into some of the shadows and try and smooth out some of those transitions and get a bit more of a shadow happening here. I'm going in and adding a specular highlight on the underside just to get a bit of a reflection happening. Some more ice yellow. And then finally the ivory. And I'm keeping the ivory really just focused on this furthest corner right here, directly facing my light source. I want that to be the brightest part. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bit of this, some green that's on my palette. I'm thinking maybe the Arati green. And I'm just going to gently glaze this into the shadow here. I'm trying to simulate some reflection happening from the flame that's in his hand. And then maybe I'll go in with the livery green and just add a little spot of highlighting on the underside of the medallion. One thing I like to do before painting the skin on the face is to actually paint the eyes. And the reason for this being we can be a little bit imprecise. We can sort of make mistakes. And if we have to correct, it's much easier to correct the shape of the eyes before painting the face as opposed to doing it afterwards, especially when we get to dotting the pupils and correcting the lining on top and bottom. It's much easier to do the eyes without having to worry about overpainting onto the skin around it. So we're going to start by painting the whites of the eyes. We're going to use ivory from Vallejo, but really any off-white will do. You want to avoid using pure white and black for this because it'll end up looking too high contrast and cartoony. We're going to get it nice and diluted. We're going to get right in there, and then we're just going to paint the eye socket in. And then from there, we're going to use tenebrous gray. Once the paint is dry, we're going to go back in and we're going to start shaping the actual eyeball. So we're going to go in on the edges, top and bottom, and we're just going to erase the overpaint. Until we're happy with the way the eyes look and that they're symmetrical on both sides. And once we're happy with the whites of the eyes, we're just going to go back in with that tenebrous gray again, and we're just going to dot the pupils. And once we've got one pupil painted in, we just go in and we mirror on the other side. And that's pretty much it. Once you've got the eyes painted in, pupils dotted, if you need, you can go back in with a little bit more tenebrous gray and just gently reshape the final shape of the eyes. And that's it. We're ready to start painting the face. So once the eyes are done, we're going to be working on the skin. And the colors we're going to be using for this, AK's Base Flesh, Beige Red, and Pale Skin. So these are our highlight colors. And then we're going to be shading with mixes of AK's Dark Sea Blue and Burnt Red. Now, the base coat is a mix of Base Flesh, Dark Sea Blue, and Burnt Red. And I've applied it uniformly over the entire model. And this is just a way to knock back some of the pinkness using either more red or blue, depending on how much or how little rosiness we want in the skin. And then what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be highlighting progressively through Beige Red and Base Flesh have quite a lot of pinkiness to it. So we're going to have to use our highlight color of Pale Skin, as well as glazes and nuances afterwards with the reds and blues, and even some purples with hex lichen afterwards to really knock back some of that pinkness. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on highlighting the basic shapes and forms. So I'm just going to jump straight to my Base Flesh. And we're going to start painting general areas of the face. So looking at areas like the forehead, the nose, and the cheekbones. And we want to use this Base Flesh to basically work out the general facial structure, anatomy of the face, sort of the basic muscle forms. He does have a goatee and a mustache, so we're going to not worry about those for now. We'll have to neaten that back up when we paint the hair and the eyebrows. And we're going to keep highlighting this by mixing in more and more of our beige red into the skin color. And we're just going to keep working up our highlights. Make sure that you really pick out the cheekbones, the eyebrows, the forehead. And then when we get to the mouth, we have the lower lip. There's the little muscle on the corner of the lip, and then his chin. And we'll keep building up our highlights into beige red and pale skin. And we'll keep highlighting by taking our beige red and brightening it even further with pale skin. So for this, we're focusing on the brightest points. We're looking at the forehead, the eyebrow, the furrows. We're going to concentrate on the cheekbones right here as well. And the nose especially. Oh, I know it's looking a little rough in the mouth area, unfortunately. There's the top of the mustache and the bottom of the goatee that I really haven't attended to yet. Once we get those painted in, it'll neaten up the face a lot. If you find it does help though and you want to neaten up the face as you go, take some tenebrous gray or some rubber black and just apply a base coat to the hair, to the goatee and the mustache. And that may help you to block out sort of this messiness area over here and start to see the skin as a little more refined, a little more polished. So to paint his hair, his mustache, and his goatee, we're using two colors, rubber black and Hellbound Flesh. These are from AK. So rubber black is an AK color and scale color is Hellbound Flesh. This is a nice sort of coolish tone in the highlights, quote unquote black, but rubber black has brown, which adds a bit of warmth to the shadows. So it's a nice little combination of the two. I've been using it as sort of an off black recipe in a bunch of my convocation, and I wanted to bring it into Doctor Strange as well, just as like a little subtle nod or connecting color. So I already base coated the hair, the mustache, and the goatee with rubber black. And we're just going to highlight by mixing in Hellbound Flesh. And we're going to focus in on blocking in sort of a general highlight first before worrying about individual strands. It's only as we progress brighter and brighter with our highlights that we need to start worrying about shaping the individual strands and picking up the individual details. At the very beginning, it's more important to focus on the overall form and shape of the head and the hair. So on this model, it is fairly straightforward. You're just highlighting a circle or a sphere, as it were. But if you were painting something like a female head with black hair, and it's got these long flowing locks and stuff, you'd have to pay attention to how you are highlighting the general form of the hair first before concerning yourself with individual strands. So we're just going to highlight all these different hair elements by progressively mixing in more Hellbound Flesh to create our highlights. Now the mouth, I painted in with rubber black as well, and we're going to leave it in that rubber black line. So when we paint the mustache, just be very careful not to overpaint too much underneath. Leave a bit of that black lining showing between the mustache and the lower lip. And the streaks on the hair on both sides. We're just going to go continuing highlighting up. So we're taking our Hellbound Flesh, and then we're going to work our way into the AK greenish white. So we're going to find where we want to introduce the white strand. So it's probably over here. And then we're just going to mix in greenish white into our hair mix. So that rubber black Hellbound Flesh color. And we're just going to highlight this like we would any other strand of hair. So I'm going to finish off by doing some final airbrush nuancing and glazing into the face and then overall into the entire figure. So I'm going to start with some burnt red. And this is mainly to focus some rosiness into the face, sort of add a bit more warmth to my shadows. And then we're going to do Hex Lichen from Vallejo Guimard, and this will be over the entire figure. We're going to focus this primarily into the midtones and shadows, and we're going to do a very low PSI, very thin layer of color, slowly build up these nuances. We're going to spray a little bit with the airbrush, and then release the trigger and push just air, and that'll help to dry that layer of color immediately. And then we'll follow up with hex lichen over the entire figure. And this is mainly just to punch up the shadows and add some real depth to the piece. This is something I do across all my Marvel models, and I've found that it's a really nice way of suddenly adding some color into the shadow that helps to make it feel darker, even though it isn't actually that dark value-wise. It has a lot to do with just putting this purple beside other colors, and just perceptually makes certain colors feel darker than they actually are. And then by using this consistent color across my entire Marvel collection, I'm able to create a unified sort of light and shadow color across all my figures. And again, we're spraying a little bit of color. This is mostly just water. This is probably 5 or 6 parts water, 1 part paint. So what you're seeing here, even though it looks really wet as I'm spraying it, you can see as it's drying, it's a very subtle color shift. We just want to take our time and build up this color, and then, if necessary, with any overspray, we can go back in and correct any oversprays that were done by this airbrushing step. The last set of touch-ups I want to do on this model is just to tweak the vibrancy of the suit. It's looking a little dark and kind of flat, in my opinion, compared to the rest of the figure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently go in and add in some very soft, bright highlights to select areas to try and make the suit pop relative to some of the adjacent parts. And again, I'm not going overboard with this. I'm just trying to add that little extra oomph of warmth. And the colors I'm using is just the colors I use for this suit. So I have dark sea blue, light Prussian blue, and Tenaire yellow. I'm keeping my coats, my paint nice and thin, so I can do lots of thin coats. And I'm just looking to glaze in some final highlights. I'll just do that pass over the entire suit, and then I'll paint the base trim black, apply a varnish of choice. I'm just using Games Workshop's old Purity Seal, and the model is complete and ready for play.